Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always up for a good deep dive.
This time, we're tackling a book that's been making waves. Utopia for Realists.
Oh, yeah, Rutger Bregman. I know, it's a really interesting one.
Yeah, he throws out these ideas that sound, well, kind of out there at first. Like, seriously, a 15-hour work week
I know, right? It sounds pretty radical.
and universal basic income, even open borders. It's like, whoa, hold on a second.
But that's what's so intriguing about Bregman, right? He doesn't just throw these ideas around for shock value.
Nope, he's got evidence. He's pulling from history, economics, even those experiments, the social ones.
Like, you gotta admit, he starts off strong. I mean, that opening where he talks about poverty,
Yeah, that's a good one, about how back in like 1820
94% of the world was in extreme poverty. It's mind-blowing.
and now under 10%. It's like we've done this incredible thing as humans.
We have. But then Bregman kind of makes you pause and think, you know? Like, we've come so far, but where are we headed? What's the vision now?
Right? It's like we hit this milestone and forgot to keep aiming higher.
And that's where those big ideas come in. He's saying we're so stuck in just keeping things going as they are.
That we've lost sight of what a truly better future could be.
Like with that 15-hour work week thing, I'll admit, my first thought was, yeah, good luck with that.
Same here. Total pie in the sky stuff, right?
But then Bregman pulls out this economist, John Maynard Keynes, from way back in 1930.
Oh yeah, I remember reading that part.
Keynes was saying basically that by now, with all the technology...
We'd only need to work a handful of hours a week. And he wasn't totally wrong.
Right. We are wealthier, we are more productive, but
Instead of more free time, we got more stress, more uncertainty about the future, about jobs, everything.
it's like we're working more, even though we could work less, at least in theory.
So how does a 15-hour work week even work? Wouldn't the economy just, like, implode?
I know, that's what I thought too, but Bregman actually dives into that. He brings up this old folk song, you know.
Big Rock, Candy Mountain.
That's it. And in the song, work is like this thing to avoid, a total bummer.
Yeah, I see the connection now.
And then there's that example of W.K. Kellogg, you know, the cereal guy.
Yeah, I love cereal.
Yeah.
So what did he do?
Back in the 30s, he decided, hey, let's try a 6-hour workday.
6 hours in his factory.
Yep, and get this, productivity went up and his employees were way happier.
It's amazing. It's like everything we've been told about working long hours is flipped on its head.
It really challenges the status quo. And there's another example Bregman uses from Britain in the 70s. There was this miners' strike, big energy shortages.
I think I remember reading about that.
The whole country basically had to go on a 3-day work week.
So did the economy tank?
Nope, not really. It held up surprisingly well.
Okay, so there are these shrieking historical examples, but still, wouldn't people get lazy?
That's the question, right? Would we all just sit around and, I don't know, watch TV all day?
Yeah, lose that drive to achieve things, to build, to contribute.
Well, Bregman's not saying it would be this simple switch, like flipping a light switch.
Okay, so there's more to it.
He's talking about a fundamental shift, like how we see life, how we spend our time. Imagine having more time for your family.
More time to learn new things, to be in your community, to actually enjoy life.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just working less, it's about living better.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
And this idea of rethinking work, it kind of ties into another one of Bregman's big proposals.
You mean universal basic income?
Yeah, the UBI. Most people hear that and think, free money, no way, that'll never work.
Yeah, that's the initial reaction, but it's more nuanced than that. Basically, everyone gets a set income, no matter if they're working or not.
And this has been tried before.
You might be surprised to hear this, but it almost happened in the U.S. under President Nixon.
No way. Nixon. I never knew that.
Yeah, it's wild. But his plan got derailed, mostly because of this fear, this historical precedent called Speenham land.
Speenham land. What's that?
It was this basic income system in England back in the late 1700s.
Oh, wow. That far back.
Yeah, and it was seen as a total flop, a disaster.
So people thought Nixon's plan would be a repeat.
Exactly. They were like, look, Speenham land crashed and burned, this will too.
So was Speenham land really that bad?
Well, Bregman dug into it, and it turns out a lot of what we think we know about it
Is wrong.
Yeah, basically. Myths, misinterpretations, bad data. Like, there was this claim that it made everyone lazy and wages plummeted.
Yeah.
Turns out, not true. Economists gone back and looked at the actual records, and Speenham land wasn't this economic apocalypse.
So Nixon's plan, which actually had some decent economic backing, got sunk by a ghost story, basically.
Pretty much. But let's move past the history for a sec.
Yeah.
What about real-world evidence about UBI, like today?
I know. Bregman talks about some experiments, right?
He does. There was this one in Canada called Mincome. They gave a basic income to an entire town.
A whole town, wow.
And poverty basically disappeared. Plus, they saw all these positive social and economic effects. Pretty remarkable.
So it can work. What about in the U.S.? Have there been any experiments here?
Yep, a few different ones. And the results are pretty interesting. Working hours didn't really decrease that much. And overall, things looked pretty good.
It really makes you wonder why we're so resistant to trying something like this on a larger scale. But I guess there are always concerns, right? What do the critics say?
The big ones are cost, obviously. How are we going to pay for this? And won't it make people stop working altogether?
Those are valid points. What does Bregman say to that?
He says, look at the bigger picture. Think about all the good that could come from it. Less poverty, better health, even higher productivity in some cases. Plus, the costs we have now with all the social programs and healthcare for people struggling.
Might actually go down if everyone had a basic safety net.
That's his argument. It's like, yeah, it costs money up front, but think long term.
Makes sense. But Bregman doesn't stop there, does he? He takes it even further with this whole open borders idea. Now, that feels like a real paradigm shift.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. I mean, open borders, it sounds, well, almost impossible.
Right. But as with everything else, he approaches it logically, with evidence, and this, deep concern for humanity.
He's saying open borders could be the single best way to fight global poverty. And get this, he claims it could boost the world's wealth by $65 trillion.
Wait, $65 trillion? That's an insane amount of money. How does he even come up with that?
He's arguing that if you let people work where they're most productive, where there's opportunity, that unlocks potential for millions.
Like we're artificially holding people back.
Right. People want better lives for themselves, their families. If you remove the barriers, that drive turns into a huge benefit for everyone.
Okay, I see the logic. But what about the argument that open borders would mean job losses here? Lower wages.
Yeah, that's a common fear. But Bregman says a lot of that's based on misunderstanding how economies really work.
So it's not as simple as immigrants take jobs.
Nope. He cites studies showing that immigration can actually boost economic activity, even lead to higher wages overall.
Okay, so there's an economic argument. But he doesn't stop there, does he?
Not at all. He talks about the morality of it, the ethics.
In this globalized world, shutting people out.
It just doesn't make sense. He's asking, what about our shared humanity? Shouldn't everyone have a chance to thrive regardless of where they're born?
Yeah, that's a powerful argument. I need a minute to process all this. We've covered so much. From work to basic income to open borders. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-bending stuff. But when we come back, we're going even deeper.
We're going to tackle the tyranny of GDP and how our own thinking can hold us back from progress. Stay tuned, folks. Things are about to get even more interesting. So we've been talking about some pretty radical ideas, rethinking work, basic income, even open borders. But Bregman doesn't stop there. He wants us to question something else, something that feels kind of fundamental to how we measure success, you know?
You mean GDP, gross domestic product?
Yeah, exactly. It's like this magic number, the higher it goes, the better, right?
Right. But Bregman's saying, hold on, is it really that simple? Is GDP really telling us the whole story?
I mean, it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
A country could have a sky-high GDP, but its people could be miserable.
Totally. And that's Bregman's point. He argues that GDP is actually a pretty flawed measure. There's a lot it doesn't capture.
Like what? What does GDP miss?
Well, for starters, all that unpaid work. Think about childcare, elder care, all that stuff.
Yeah, it's essential, keeps society running, but it's not in the GDP calculation.
Right, it's like it doesn't even exist. Like it has no value, which is crazy.
What else does GDP overlook?
Well, it doesn't really account for advancements in knowledge and technology. Like our phones are getting more powerful and cheaper every year.
So they barely even register in GDP, but they're having a huge impact on our lives.
Exactly. And then there's the fact that GDP often prioritizes, risky financial activities over essential services.
Wait, so a CEO making millions from, hedge funds contributes more to GDP than a teacher or a nurse?
That's the logic, yeah. It's kind of messed up when you think about it. Bregman argues that this whole GDP obsession has led to these policies that focus on short-term economic growth.
At the expense of everything else, like community, well-being, the environment.
Exactly. We're so busy chasing that GDP number that we're neglecting what really matters.
So if GDP is so flawed, what's the alternative? How do we measure real progress?
Well, Bregman suggests we need new metrics, like a dashboard that takes into account things like community service, well-being.
Oh, and that thing he talks about, time affluence, right?
Yes, having more control over your time, not feeling constantly rushed and stressed.
A dashboard for a good life.
Yeah.
That just makes so much more sense. Okay, so Bregman's pushing us to look beyond these traditional ways of seeing the world.
He is. And he also wants us to understand how our own thinking can hold us back. He talks about this concept called cognitive dissonance.
Oh yeah, I remember that. It's that uncomfortable feeling you get when you have two conflicting beliefs. Like, you know something's wrong, but you don't want to admit it.
Exactly. And Bregman argues that this happens on a much larger scale, like in society as a whole.
So we cling to beliefs even when there's evidence against them.
Yeah. And Bregman gives this wild example of a doomsday cult. They predicted the world was going to end.
And when it didn't?
They doubled down on their beliefs. Like, they became even more convinced they were right.
Wow, that's crazy. I mean, it's human nature, right? Nobody wants to admit they were wrong. How does this play out in the real world?
Well, think about climate change. There's overwhelming scientific consensus, but some people still deny it.
It's like our brains are wired to resist change, even if it's for the better. So how do we break free from that? How do we become more open to new ideas, especially ones that challenge our beliefs?
That's the big question, right? Bregman emphasizes critical thinking, being willing to question our assumptions. He even talks about Alan Greenspan, the former Fed chairman.
Yeah. Wasn't he a huge believer in free markets?
Totally. But after the 2008 financial crisis, he had this realization, this kind of epiphany.
Like his whole worldview was shaken.
Yeah, he was shocked. He admitted that his ideas had been wrong.
That's amazing, if someone like Greenspan can have that moment of self-reflection.
It shows that we all have to be willing to change our minds when presented with new evidence. Because as Bregman says, ideas shape history, no matter how out there they might seem at first.
So it's a call to be more open-minded, to be more willing to change, to embrace new ideas.
Absolutely. And Bregman provides so many examples of how that's happened throughout history.
Like those movements you mentioned earlier, abolition, women's suffrage, civil rights. They all started with ideas that were considered radical at the time.
Exactly. It's a reminder that change is possible. Even seemingly impossible ideas can gain traction and transform the world.
And that's what Bregman wants us to remember. He ends the book with this incredibly thought-provoking question. If we find it difficult to imagine that our beliefs shape history, then what else does?
It's a powerful question, right? It makes you realize that we all have a responsibility, not just through our actions, but also through our beliefs, because those beliefs ultimately shape the future.
You know, what strikes me about Bregman is he's not just complaining. He's not just pointing fingers and saying everything's broken.
No, he's definitely a solutions-oriented kind of thinker.
Right. He's laying out these alternatives, like actual ways things could be different. And he's got those examples, real-world stuff.
Yeah, it's not just theory with him. He's grounding it in, like, look, this has worked before, or at least here's a version of it that we could try.
And the thing is, a lot of these ideas, they're not even that new.
Right. They've been floating around for a while, some of them for, like, centuries.
But they always get slapped with that label, utopian. Like, oh, nice idea, but it'll never happen in the real world.
And that's what Bregman's pushing back against. He's saying not only can they happen, they kind of have to if we want a better future.
If we want things to be fairer, to be sustainable, you know. And he's got all those historical stories woven in.
Oh, yeah. Those are great. How progress often came from these ideas that were, like, totally radical at the time.
Considered dangerous, even. Like, think about it. Abolishing slavery. The fight for women to vote. The civil rights movement.
All those were driven by people who were like, no, this isn't right. We can do better. They had that vision, and then they fought for it.
Bregman's basically saying, don't underestimate the power of ideas, because they really can change history.
And I think that's the core message here, a call to action, like, let's reclaim our imaginations.
Don't get stuck in just managing problems. Let's actually envision solutions.
Yeah, embrace those big, bold dreams, even if they seem impossible at first.
So as we wrap up this whole deep dive into Utopia for Realists, what's the one thing you hope people take away?
It's simple, really. Don't just settle for how things are. Don't let cynicism or fear, stop you from thinking big.
And remember, your imagination, it's powerful. It's the starting point for a better world.
So keep questioning, keep exploring, keep having those deep dives. And who knows, maybe we'll see some of these utopian ideas become reality.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone, and we'll catch you next time.